it's a great pleasure for me to be able to do this interview with you about such an important topic about gender-based violence. Avni Amin was one of our special guests at the Medicus Mundi AIDS Focus Conference 2018 in Bern. Every day, millions of women and girls worldwide experience violence. This abuse takes many forms, including intimate, physical, and sexual partner violence, female genital mutilation, rape, sex trafficking, child and forced marriage. Avni, at the conference you talked about intimate partner violence. What is the current evidence? Who is affected by it, and what exactly is intimate partner violence?
So the definition of intimate partner violence is really physical, sexual, and psychological violence by someone who a person either is married to, cohabitates with, and it could be a current husband or boyfriend or cohabitating partner, or it could be a former partner. Now, depending on the cultural context, in some contexts, it's largely refers to husbands only. And in other contexts, it includes a wide range of partnerships. So the definition is quite broad to capture all types of partnerships, recognizing that, starting from a fairly young age, women might be in dating relationships or in partnerships. And in many settings, girls are married quite early. So we sort of capture the whole range of partnerships. The forms of violence that are included, physical violence often includes a range of acts such as slapping, hitting, strangling, pushing somebody down, using weapons on them. Sexual violence refers to any act of coerced sex or forcing the person to do sexual acts that they don't want to do. And it obviously includes rape. And then psychological violence, the definitions of psychological violence include a range of acts such as insulting, humiliating, threatening the loved ones, making the person feel really bad about themselves all the time in front of other people, etc. So these are the ways in which violence is sort of measured. And the most common form of violence is intimate partner violence. The data show globally that 30% of women experience this form of violence, and this is women between the ages 15 to 49. Now there's that's a lot. That's almost 1 in 3. And there is variation across regions. But what we know is that there is no country where this doesn't occur. Even in Switzerland, the data show at least 20% of women. In other settings, like in Middle East or Southeast Asia region, or even in Latin America or even North America, the rates are not that much different than Switzerland. Latin America, it's around 30%. In the Southeast Asia, WHO Southeast Asia region, it's around 37-38%. So as you can see, there is variation, which in some ways is a good thing in the sense it tells you that this violence is not natural. It's not endemic. It's preventable. And there are
important part.
Yeah. And there are some factors that exist in some settings that make it more likely that women will experience violence. And in other settings, there are other factors that make it less likely that women will experience violence. So it's important to understand that while it is universal, it's preventable.
And what are the pathways to intimate partner violence?
The research shows very clearly 2 groupings of factors, 2 what we call set of big kind of factors that explain the likelihood that a person will experience violence or the likelihood that a man will perpetrate violence against his intimate partner. And those are grouped largely into a history of violence in childhood and gender inequality. Now, the history of violence in childhood is related to the fact that violence is a learned behavior. It's not, people sort of say, oh, it must be natural or it's inevitable or, you know, men are naturally aggressive. That's not true. What we know is that very young, when boys and girls see violence happening in their homes, in their communities, in their societies, in their schools, that um, that sort of has an impact. Secondly, when children themselves are subjected to violence by parents, by school teachers, by other community members, then again the trauma and the effects of that make it more likely that they will either perpetrate or experience violence when they grow up. So childhood violence is a big pathway, and it's an important thing to remember because that's an important area for prevention. The second set of factors have to do with what we call gender inequality. Now, in that, there's a range of things. One is settings where uh, girls and women have less access to educational and employment opportunities. Then there is what we call gender norms, norms that condone violence and norms that uphold what we call a culture of men's privilege and power over women. And in those cultural contexts, then what happens is when violence occurs, societies, the community, the family, even sometimes the legal frameworks don't necessarily condemn or punish this kind of violence. What they do is they accept it as normal. And when that becomes the case, then a lot of times women will think this is normal. They won't report it. And also that societies will not come forward to prevent it. So we have to address the lack of power that women have. We also have to address the lack of opportunities, both educational and employment opportunities that women have. But we also have to tackle what we call gender norms. Then within the gender inequality set of factors, there's also relationship level factors, such as relationships where there is very high level of marital conflict or relationship conflict, where there is less skills and ability to resolve those conflicts without violence, and relationships in some settings where there is substance use like alcohol or drugs or whatever. We are very careful in saying that alcohol and drugs are not causes of violence, because there are settings in which there is no alcohol or substance use and there's still high levels of violence, but it can be a trigger when there is stress, there is conflict, etc. So that's sort of important to understand. And then there are also what we call macro community level factors, which are important and often sort of in addition to the gender and the childhood violence also can play a role. One of them is poverty. And the other is where there are communities where generally there is high level of violence in general. So communities where, you know, you'll have gang violence, general level of community violence, because in those communities, there's a sense that this kind of violence is tolerated, law enforcement might be weak, there might be more wider availability of weapons, etc. And so you also have to look at the community level factors like poverty and general high levels of violence in the community.
That is fantastic. I love listening to you. You have so much knowledge about all the pathways and can you tell us a bit more about how to prevent and minimize intimate partner violence?
So the field of violence against women prevention is growing in terms of the evidence that we know about what works. There are a number of large initiatives that have been started in the recent past 5 years that are actually building the evidence very systematically and rigorously about what works to prevent violence. However, that being said, we have some ways to go. We have enough knowledge, but we also need to have more knowledge about the best ways to prevent violence in different contexts. Based on the fact that I said there are two sets of factors, gender inequality related factors and factors related to childhood violence, that researchers, programmers, people are beginning to implement interventions that tackle these two groupings of factors, as well as then taking into account issues of poverty, etc. So we have interventions that work to prevent violence in childhood, working with parents to prevent child maltreatment, working with schools to prevent violence in schools, working then with adolescents and groups of children to do what we call sort of group reflections around nonviolent conflict resolution. So these are some of the interventions that are being implemented. So for example, in Uganda, in about 250 schools, there was an implementation and a trial of what we call Good Schools Toolkit. And this was a whole of school approach where teachers, students, the administration, all of them work together to create a violence-free environment in school. So teachers are not allowed to do corporal punishment, bullying between children is prevented, parents are brought into the discussion about preventing corporal punishment at home. School administrators take the responsibility for making sure that if there is incidents of violence, these are handled properly. And this intervention, when it was trialed with good rigorous study design, showed an impact in reducing physical violence against children, with the hopes that then that will eventually lead to reductions in them perpetrating violence as they get older. On the gender inequality side, there have been a range of interventions that have been trialed. The first is that there are interventions that are trying to empower women and girls. So there are interventions that give economic livelihood training to women and girls, that give microfinance and loans to women to set up their own businesses so that they can be economically independent. And these have been trialed in South Africa. There are trials going on in Tanzania, trials going on in Peru and in other different settings. And in South Africa, it showed a reduction in 55% in prevalence of intimate partner violence in the community where this intervention was implemented. Then there are interventions that are trialing gender norm change. And again, what they do is they work with everyone in the community, because norms are upheld by everyone, not by one individual, by families or households, but everybody. And so they've tried to implement these participatory interactive approaches to bring everybody in the community to understand how power affects families and misuse of power affects families, and to lead them through a process of change where the ultimate sort of aim is that, you know, people recognize a non-violent, power coercive ways of behaving with each other. And this has been trialed it's called SASA. It's been trialed in Uganda, and again showed about 52% reduction in prevalence of intimate partner violence. And it's being replicated in other settings. So right now, under a DFID-funded initiative called What Works to Prevent Violence Against Women, there are many more such projects being implemented to kind of build a very robust body of evidence in different settings to sort of know whether these different approaches work in all cultural and economic settings, or whether they are only likely to work in some settings. So that's what's happening. And in a few years, we'll have a lot more evidence. Now, what we are learning from some of these projects is that a couple of important things. First is that prevention works when you don't insist on one size fits all and one type of approach. Prevention requires multiple approaches to work together. So in SASA and in some of these studies in South Africa, Tanzania, etc., they always try to implement different approaches in the community. So it's not enough just to empower women economically. You have to work with men simultaneously and with community members simultaneously, so that they also realize the importance of these issues. Otherwise, what you have is what we call backlash. So when you only empower women, then men might feel threatened and there might be more violence as a result. So the idea is to prevent this by also working simultaneously with men, simultaneously with communities like religious leaders or community leaders to change norms even as you empower women. So in short, the message is that you have to have multiple approaches at multiple levels, and you also have to implement them over a sufficient period of time for change to occur, because change doesn't occur overnight, but it can occur within a reasonable period of time. So you have to give at least 6 to 8 months to a year for this kind of changes to become embedded, because people are grappling with these norms and attitudes and behaviors that have been entrenched in their psyche for a very, very long time. So that's why you need time to overcome this.
Yeah, exactly. So thanks so much for sharing all this evidence. That's fantastic. And it was exactly at the conference where we all had all the other speakers, they also came to the conclusion, no single intervention is sufficient. We need more intervention at the same time, tackling different levels in order to prevent and minimize violence. So thanks a lot for sharing that. And I mean, you did a fantastic work. You led the development of the Global Plan of Action on Health System Response to Violence Against Women, which was endorsed by 193 countries at the World Health Assembly. What else is WHO doing in order to minimize and prevent intimate partner violence or violence against women?
So our work on violence against women focuses on 4 major areas. And within each area, we have multiple sort of activities and projects and products. The first sort of priority we are giving to is to evidence and data building. And this goes back to the fact that it's when you have data and evidence that you can really make a difference in terms of advocating for with policymakers, with communities, with the program implementers, that this is important. So we are working on building on the WHO multi-country study, which was an instrument that was developed some 10, 15 years back to conduct studies, comparable prevalence studies across countries. We are working to update the survey instrument to include more measures of sexual violence, including sexual harassment, and also to improve the measurement of emotional and psychological violence. Then we are working to develop estimates. So in 2013, we published the first set of estimates on intimate partner violence and non-partner sexual violence. And now we're working to reproduce those estimates because it's been 5 years. And many, many more countries have done surveys and studies in this last 5-7 years. So we want to publish a new set of estimates to see if things are improving. Now, this is contributing to what we call global monitoring of the SDGs, particularly the SDG 5.2 target, which is to eliminate all forms of violence against women and girls, and which has 2 indicators. One is on prevalence of intimate partner violence, and the other is on prevalence of non-partner sexual violence. So we're contributing to that global monitoring efforts. The second area of work we are doing is keeping in line with our mandate, which is on the health system or health sector. We have a whole bunch of tools, norms, and guidelines on strengthening the health system's response to violence against women. And this is because even though preventing and responding to violence requires multi-sectoral approaches, the health has a very important role to play, both in terms of mitigating, but also in terms of prevention. Because health sector, often health workers are community leaders, they are role models in the community, they can be advocates, they can be champions, they can work with policymakers, other sector policymakers to present the data and say, okay, this is how a public health approach to prevention could work, etc. But also to respond to survivors in a compassionate, empathetic, appropriate way, and link those survivors to other services that they need, such as if they need legal services, if they need shelters, if they need social services. The third area of work which we're doing is around building evidence and advocating for prevention. And in that, we've published several tools to bring the evidence to bear on what works to prevent violence. We are also developing a tool for policymakers on prevention with other UN partners. And we build a lot of capacity of ministries of health and other sector ministries around prevention. The last area of work is what we call advocacy and technical support to countries to strengthen capacities of ministries of health around both prevention and response. And that's where the Global Plan of Action came about. It was a result of member states asking for this and us then working with them to negotiate that, but also now working to implement that in countries, to advocate with governments, to advocate with partners, to advocate with donors, to advocate with the general public in many settings around the importance of addressing violence against women as a public health issue. And a lot of work goes into working with countries directly on this and helping them develop their national protocols and guidelines, and working to strengthen capacities of health workers through training, etc.
Wow, that's a huge area of work you are doing. It's fantastic that you are doing all this kind of work. We really need it in order to prevent and minimize violence against women. Would you like to have a final word, a final message for us?
Yeah, I think that one thing maybe is important to remember is that violence is preventable, but it requires a lot of sectors and institutions to work together to amplify, because no one person or no one group or no one institution can work in isolation. It really requires a joined up effort to address this. The second sort of message I have is that, in every type of programming that we do, whether it's health, whether it's agriculture, whether it's economic development, it is important to think of how you're going to both prevent violence as well as respond to violence. Because in all of these sectors and in all of these settings, inevitably where you have women who are either beneficiaries or women who are implementers, that they are facing violence. And so it's important to think of the potential harms of any project on violence, but also to tackle violence and harassment and different types of abuse as part of any kind of project integrated into those projects, whether it's health, whether it's economic development, whether it's education, etc. And so it's really making sure that it's not left out from the thinking. We always say that anywhere you have large groups of women or even small groups of women, they're going to face violence. They're facing violence in their personal lives, but many of them might face violence in the workplace, because that's just the nature of patriarchy and power and privilege. And so we all have to be thinking about how to do it and how to prevent it in every context.
Yeah. Fantastic. Thank you so much for this interview. I wish you a lot of success and for all your endeavors at the WHO.
Thank you so much. And it was a pleasure to talk to you. And thank you so much for the opportunity to share some of our thoughts and work.